so you can. Ooh.
Okay, you're live.
Okay, all right. So welcome everybody to the panel, How Do We Rage with the Machine? Exploring the AI song space, which was inspired by the 2020 inaugural AI song contest. And thanks to Bob Sturm for putting the idea in my head to put this panel together. And I am very, if you want to know what that machine is, that's in our backyard factory. It's a Europlacer pick and place machine. It puts surface mount components onto circuit boards. A different kind of machine that I was raging with earlier today. I am very happy to have with me on the panel today Vincent Copes, who is one of the members of the judging panel for the song contest, and Anna Huang as well, who was also on that panel. And Portrait XO, who was part of Team Databots and Portrait XO, who were very highly ranked in the, in fact, they were ranked #1 by the panel for their use of AI for the song. Ashley Burgoyne from considered team Can AI Kick It? And Tom Collins, who not only was part of Team Brentry, but has also been working with Imogen Heap on AI songs, which is something that I'm really keen to hear more about. So welcome everybody, and thank you panel members for being part of this panel. Now I'll see if I go to my next slide. We've got a few questions, and I'll start by saying what the question is: how do we incorporate human musicians in AI and human collaboration? And we're going to talk mostly about how that relates to what we did in the AI song contest, and the panel judges will talk about what other team members did, and a few related projects. So in my case, I was part of Team Uncanny Valley from Australia. And while most people, I guess the default kind of approach is to generate lyrics from a text generating algorithm like GPT-2, which is a neural network that's been trained on lots of text, and then fine-tuning it on lyrics and seeing what you get and choosing the bits you like. And for generating melodies, training on a set of melodies and choosing the generated ones that you like, or tweaking them or whatever. And so that's certainly part of our process. But the bit that went a bit further was that I thought, why would you want to manually try to line up these bits of lyric and melody when you can do that in an automated fashion? I've got an information retrieval background, and I said, right, we can turn that into strings of stress patterns and then match on that. And that made it a little bit easier to come up with fragments for the songs. And it also, as a side effect, had the it had some repetition in there. Like, you know, we had 2 lines that started with flying from this world that has gone apart, and that had the same pattern as the other flying lyric, and they both were matched to the same melody. So we automatically had patterns in the songs. And of course, the infamous koala synth sound that was that was trained on koalas, kookaburras, and Tasmanian devils. Other than that, I think what we did was pretty standard, but we had a really great producing team turning into a fantastic song. So next up, I thought I'd ask Ashley to talk about what Can AI Kick It do that was special and different.
Well, I think for us, we started out very, very early. So we had the benefits of working with the VPRO, which is one of the large Dutch broadcasters. And so they have, of course, very good access to popular artists in the Dutch community. And so we decided very early, okay, we really want this song in any case performed by a human, which itself was actually very different than the choices of many other people in the contest. And then as soon as we started there, that immediately brought us to this question of, well, then how do we set these rules? So we worked with a very popular Dutch artist named Willy Wartaal. And there's maybe I can jump, toward the most interesting point, which is where we finally had AI generated music ready to give to him. And the agreement had always been, we're not going to give you a finished piece. We're going to give you pieces that you can put together how you want. But then his reaction was immediately, oh, but I can take out notes here and I can compress this and I can shrink that. He really wanted a very, very generous, interpretation. And in terms of what is the potential for AI generated music, I found that conversation very exciting. In the real world, of course, do whatever you want with what the AI gave you. But in the context of an AI generated song contest, we had to say, well, really, actually, no, really, please don't. It's like, you can't even take a note out. It's like, you can mix and match these loops however you like. You can choose the instrument that you want. You can choose what you want to sing, but you need to leave, these measures that we put together, fully intact. And he found that incredibly challenging. In the end, I think it came out very well, but it was a really interesting insight that it never even occurred to him that he wouldn't be able to change anything, and how he would have been very excited if he could change something, but making it a sort of puzzle piece exercise, if you will, was actually, for him at least, a very unsatisfying artistic challenge.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I certainly think that the process that people went through would have been different if it hadn't been a song contest. And that's an interesting point. And I agree. But by the way, I loved that track so much that I bought it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's hear from Portrait XO about your piece and how you went about it.
Sure. So I can focus on my portion of this piece and how I discovered the process. And that's something that I've really fallen in love with just from collaborating with my project partners, DataBots. And although I'm not a coder myself, I'm very inspired by creative code because I think the code itself is just as creative as the artist's perspective of like writing a song or a melody. And so my obsession with technology has kind of like led me here. And I think like the way humans can collaborate with AI, I think it opens up like a new way of intimate reflection of how we work. At least that's what I discovered with the process that we use, which was feeding AI a whole bunch of songs of Eurovision songs from like the 1950s and listening back to these melodies and lyrics that sometimes made sense and sometimes didn't. And because we fed raw audio, we had very little control over like what was coming out. And I played with some MIDI generated stuff, and that was really fun too. But something about the raw audio came out with these weird glitches that I just found really creepy but fascinating at the same time. And because the AI outputs were not smart enough to come up with like full melodic phrases or full lyrics, it became this kind of like game of autocomplete or like fill in the blank. And so that became the first approach of piecing together these bits that make some kind of a sense and create a story out of it. And it's been interesting too, because I thought in the beginning that creating this kind of process would make some kind of like less personal approach to songwriting, but in the end, it like some of my own personal story kind of came through it, and somehow it ended up being about like a person, this man, being very depressed and drinking through the pandemic period and seeking like some kind of social connection with people outside of isolation. So I think it's like a lot of it is what you make of it, and it opens up for the human mind to imagine like what is all this gurgle trying to say and do. And I think that's where the magic is. That's the weird glitches in between.
Thank you. Yeah, and of course, Portrait XO has now also got an entire album that's been inspired by this process, hasn't it? That it's and I've listened to a draft of it, and I found it real. Yeah, like you say, it is, sure, it's using AI, but it is very personal, and it expresses that personal connection very strongly, and it's very emotional to listen to. And I liked your expression. Was it creepy but fascinating or something? And that's certainly something that, yes, I get that reaction to the Databox bots song, and it's yeah, it is fascinating. And some of the imagery that gets generated also has that creepy but fascinating feel about it. So let's move on to Tom. Now, Tom, you were a victim of the pandemic with your entry to the contest, I believe, but you've done some interesting things beyond that with Imogen Heap as well. I was wondering if you could share your comments about the process and also working with musicians.
Yeah,
with AI.
I can say that, yeah, Imogen and I started talking in January, and you know, it was kind of in a way kind of her interviewing me and seeing if you know, this was interesting enough to pursue, because I don't know, for you know, those in the audience who know her work, her musical work, but also her kind of work in pioneering music technology and you know, other areas. I think she's had a lot on her plate, and a lot of options. So there was a lot of initial questions about you know, what type of input could she work with. I think something I learned about the process is that, you know, musicians may often want to hear what the AI interprets from their own previous works and could spit back at them, you know, often maybe from audio or from song input, rather than from where my work had been to date, which is mostly in symbolic music processing. So that's one thing, you know. I think she has a project that was kind of going alongside, where she has an AI Imogen, where fans can like type questions, and you know, there's some automaticity in the replies, and she kind of will fill in gaps if there's a question where, you know, that doesn't work for whatever reason. So, you know, I think she was kind of interested in the project from the outset, had kind of serious concerns about the ethical angles in terms of especially the data set provided by VPRO. So she didn't want to use that in the first instance. So I spent like a good chunk of time in January and February basically trying to get the audio from her back catalogue in as good a shape as possible, that it would work with my symbolic music processing, you know, history and algorithms. And then probably, I don't know, we're talking maybe 3 weeks before the deadline, we were kind of realizing it's not going to work, because even with the up-to-date source separation and you know, state-of-the-art transcription algorithms, you know, if you put nonsense in, you're going to get nonsense out. And I think, you know, we were still kind of getting stuff that the texture was too thick, and it was more work to try to unpick interesting stuff in there than it was to start with melodic fragments such as could be provided by using the VPRO. So we switched to VPRO, and I think probably my best answer to the panel today is how can we measure the extent to which resulting song plagiarise existing music? So I'll leave my answer for that to later, but I managed to convince her that it was okay to participate using that data. And then, yeah, as I said, we were running close to the deadline. She had made it clear from the start as well, you know, maybe there won't be an official release out of this, because Imogen, I'm not sure how long it's been, but I might not be exaggerating to say it's maybe 2 or 3 years since she's released a song. I think she's, you know, become more interested in technologies around music. And so, yeah, then the lockdown happened, and she had to manage a lot of things to do with that. And so I have her rough draft, but I'm not allowed to release it. The you know, the BBC Click featured it in their coverage of the song contest, and so you can hear 5 or 10 second snippets of it through that. And yeah, I found it fascinating listening to. I basically gave her, stop me if I'm going too long, Sandra. Tell me to shut up.
It is over 3 minutes.
Right. I'll be
But
quiet. I'll talk more later.
okay, thank you so much, Tom. Yeah, I did love your lockdown video though for your entry, as well as the name of the team. They were both great. Um, so, oh, hang on, we're not finished yet, are we? Sorry, just got distracted. Anna, if you can maybe comment on some of the other techniques used by teams that enter the competition. And then Vincent can top up after that.
Thank you.
So,
yeah, I'm very excited to be here because the AI song contest was virtual this year. So we actually didn't get to meet everyone. So in a way, I feel like this is the after party. Like we we finally get to chat about what happened behind the scenes. For Vincent and I, who were the judges, our kind of window into everybody's entry was the process document that everybody wrote. So Vincent had this brilliant idea of now judging a song with AI. We're not just looking at the final song, but we're looking at the process. So it's a lot of going behind the scenes and seeing what that workflow looked like. And yeah, just hearing everybody talk about kind of their different approach. In a way, I feel like the approaches were very different, but some of the challenges were common. For example, writing a song is already very challenging. It's a creative process. As artists, as musicians, we all know we're not always in the flow, and there's a lot of kind of hard parts that we go through. So there's a bit of kind of like we try to do a lot of exploration, and then we try to converge on something. So there's this flare and focus process. And when we're also trying to partner with AI and use these algorithms, then we have another kind of process of how do we get the machine learning right? Like how do we get the machine learning to kind of align with our musical goals? So then we saw a lot of teams kind of juggle with this process a lot. It's not just there's like this model we can use, but it's like exploring many different kinds of models and seeing what they're capable of doing musically. Is it producing results that I want? And in cases where it's not yet producing results that we want, is there something still there? So we were very excited about Portrait XO's and DataBot's entry because when the neural networks seem to have failed to generate very coherent vocal tracks, they really listened closely and seeing like, oh, what are the ways it fails? Like as Portrait XO was mentioning, like what are the glitches that actually are the jams that could be really interesting and different and new, and turning that actually into kind of the core of the piece. So seeing that we were very, very inspired. Overall, some of the challenges is, as some folks have mentioned, AI oftentimes is not decomposable. Like when it fails, you can't go, there's no knobs for you to go in and tweak it. Like if the texture is too thick, the audio is there. There's no tangible objects that you can manipulate. Also, a lot of times, AI is not aware of the context that it's generating for. So it doesn't know about the larger kind of the story that you're going for, the larger musical context, or even the other lines in the music. It's kind of generating these like isolated pieces that later on the musician has to put together. And the last point is AI is often not steerable. So if this is an example also from the DataBot's Portrait XO team, they wanted to make a darker chorus, but there isn't a knob that you can just like go in and say like, okay, I want this to be darker. I want this part to sound more elaborate. But instead, they had to go through like 3 different neural networks and 3 different interfaces to put in their material, to rewrite it, to reharmonize it in order to achieve that. So we were,
Okay.
yeah, the creative strategies were very interesting.
Okay, thank you, Anna. And Vincent, do you want to add to that?
Well, I think what I would add is that, so as Anna and Portodexo already said, and Ashley and Tom as well, so usually what we saw was entrants generating a lot of small bits and pieces using different models and trying to combine that by humans. And this is, on the one hand, this is because it's just very hard to create a single model that does everything. But on the other hand, there's also this really interesting problem that you also want to be, you want to be creative yourself as a human. So there's like you also want to be able to turn the knobs and basically put the music together as you want it as a composer. So you want to have influence, and there's a really interesting like balance there that is really hard to solve, I think.
Thank you. Now, Ashley, you've got your hand up, so you wanted to add something.
I just wanted to say, so when Anna started talking about glitches, and Vincent as well, we also had a pretty big oops with respect to human content in our process, where so we did use, despite some teams' ethical issues with it, we did use, as VPRO's team, the VPRO dataset of historical Eurovision entries to try to train our AI. And that sounded like a very reasonable thing to do. But then what we really just didn't think about, and it was a silly mistake, we should have known better, was that everything in that data set was something that had already had a certain measure of Eurovision success. There was nothing that didn't already sound like a pop song. There was nothing that was really, truly terrible. And so when you looked at the features that the AI was optimizing for, it was optimizing kind of on an assumption that everything you fed into it was at a baseline of reasonable. But our AI did not generate everything that was at a baseline of reasonable. And so it really would push towards some of our top ranked melodies, towards things that just sounded really quite bizarre, and Vili Vartal made a very smart selection, I think, out of those choices, because in the end, not being a human, the AI was perfectly happy to say, oh yeah, well, that maximizes the features of the model, so let's use that as the melody, even though most humans would listen to it and think, no, maybe really not this.
Yeah, definitely. I know in our particular team that we discarded audio generation, which was tried, but the team weren't very happy with it. But we did keep all of the other quirks that happened, like bugs in my software and all the rest, still influenced how things ended up sounding in the end, which was kind of annoying to me when I was listening to it. But so we've got another question, which is, I will advance to it at last. What is good AI pop music? And I'd like Vincent to first say something about it.
So maybe from my perspective, it's good to discuss it a little bit from the AI Song Contest perspective. So the way we tried to solve this, I don't think you can solve this, but so we split up the question, right? So we said we'll ask the audience like, what do you think of the music? So they could rate it on several categories. So we just said, okay, the audience can deal with whether they like the song or not. And then we, as an AI panel, we focused on the AI part. So what AI was used. Was it used in a creative way? How did it deal with bugs and glitches? And also really important, how did the teams cooperate with each other? So we really like it when teams would consist of musicians and engineers or AI people or data scientists, and that they would really work together so they could learn from each other and exchange ideas. So this is basically how we as a AI Song Contest approach this question. But there are of course a million ways to approach this.
Thank you. And Anna, would you like to add anything to that? Oh, have we still got an Anna?
Sorry.
Yes, we do.
I got
my screen only shows 6 people. Sorry, yeah, Anna?
I think, yes.
Oh, you're glitching. Is it glitching for everybody or is it just me? Okay. Well, maybe we'll come back to you, Anna. Hold that thought and maybe the glitch will go away. Let's go to Tom.
So for me, one of the most interesting parts that Imogen put in the song was a generated melody segment that spanned at least 2 octaves, maybe a bit more, and she popped a vocal line on top of it as part of the bridge in her song. And I thought that was really cool, because if I had listened to that, I would have just dismissed it as a potential component of the song. It was just not something a human would write, but it was kind of like a challenge within the challenge for her to, she heard it and she thought, yeah, I can do that. So I think that is, you know, one way in which AI pop music or AI music in the hands of humans can be really interesting and innovative. It kind of, you know, challenges the humans who are in the loop to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily have done.
Great, thank you for that. Who was I? Oh, Anna, do you want to try again? Whoops. Have we lost Anna completely? Okay, then let's move on to Portrait XO. I don't know if you do you class what you do as pop music, or would you just not call it that? And anyway, what is good AI music and what is good AI pop music from your perspective?
Wow, this is such an interesting question to answer. From my perspective in the realm of songwriting, I think like we're always looking for flow and inspiration and storytelling. And for me, what became really obvious through the interaction with AI approaches was how creative can I be, and how are these tools serving as new inspiration, and is it possible to trigger flow in a new way? And the interesting aspect for me was how quick I was able to get into flow because the inspirations were so unique and interesting. So it was like every time I heard a lyric or melody jump out, it just immediately threw me into like this goosebump moment of, whoa, did it just sing that? And then it would inspire this new story. And I think those are the gold moments that every writer is looking for. And I think it doesn't matter how experienced you are, we all face challenging moments when we hit writer's block. And we need to go out and experience life, or input new content into our lives in one form or another, to then have new content to put out. And so I look at good AI pop music in a way of kind of like, maybe it's just a new way to streamline that process to get into flow. And we have so much data in the world, so it's really great that we have these new options now available and new processes. And I think for me, at least, like learning about the processes have been so interesting, and I've just been so much more fascinated and interested in learning the details of like, what are these algorithms doing, and translating that into storytelling. And I don't know, for me at least, when I listen to really good pop songs, because I appreciate all different kinds of music, it's always like the story behind it, the melodies, and I think the human role is always very crucial, but inspiration can come from everywhere. I think sometimes we get very hung up on, with the topic of AI at least, is like, people have this preconceived idea that as artists, we want like AI to do everything for us. At least those are the interesting conversations that sometimes like I get questioned that, and it's then we've got to have like a deep conversation. Like, no, wait, let's strip back from level one to like how we got here. And so I appreciate that these conversations are happening so that we can kind of like lift the hood a bit and reveal what's really happening and where are the inspiration points along this process.
I love that. Triggering flow. Yeah, I certainly experienced a bit of that during our process. I mean, the thing that triggered flow was a couple of different melody fragments that had been sung by the synthetic voice, and I was itching to turn that into another song, but of course I was still having to finish the main song that the team were doing, so it got put to the side. But there were certainly moments of inspiration there for me too. Vincent, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that's a really good point by Portradexo, is that I think AI music, especially in the context of the AI song contest, was really about process and about how can the AI help in creating new creative ways or help you with songwriting, get you out of your comfort bubble, or let you create things you haven't thought of before, or new sounds, or new ways of composing. I think that's important. I don't think you can. Maybe it's even good when you cannot hear that it's an AI song. Maybe it's good. Maybe it's a good song if you cannot hear that it was composed with AI. I mean, AI, of course, doesn't sound like anything. So it's to me the process is really important.
Thank you for that. Ashley, would you like to add to this question?
I mean, I think I'll take I mean, in some ways a different tune. I mean, I also see some questions in the Slack channel. I mean, there's a part of me as an academic and a statistician who of course is really fascinated by wanting to look under the hood and see how things are done. But for me, when it comes to AI generated music, I think that my own criteria aren't so different from my criteria in listening to any music. And it's kind of similar to a certain language of music criticism. I'm looking for this balance between exploration and exploitation, if you will, something that's familiar enough that I feel like I can place it, within a genre, within an artist, but at the same time is doing just a little something where your ear catches and you think, oh, that's really cool. I hadn't really quite thought they'd go in that direction, but that really works. And that's a very difficult sweet spot for human artists to find. And it's even more difficult, I think, for AI to find, because how do you quantify that? How do you measure that balance? But I think even in the best imaginable scenario, a good AI artist will be very similar to a human artist, and that there'll be some artists that somehow manage to keep renewing themselves, and even over a decades-long career continue to surprise you, saying, oh yeah, that's still absolutely them, and yet there's something new here. And there'll be other artists that you may love when you hear the first album. And so when you first hear an AI, thinking, oh, this is really neat. This is really cool. But then the more you listen to it, if it fails to innovate, eventually like, okay, yeah, that was cool, but I don't hear it changing from what it does. So I think, that's the balance. And it's a very basic thing. It's at the heart of making good music. And I guess in the end, I don't think it's any easier or any harder for AI than it is for a human. It's just different. But even for humans, it's also really, really, really hard.
Yeah, interesting point. I don't know. I don't know if I have an opinion about what is good AI pop music. As you say, it's what is good music and what isn't good music. The AI is just another variable. It's still the output that kind of matters. But I don't know. I don't think I'll answer my own question. So let's just check one more time to see if Anna has solved her internet problem. Are you there, Anna? I don't see an Anna. Does anyone see an Anna? Nope. Okay, well, let's move on to my next question, which is, will AI pop songs still be interesting when they're indistinguishable from human-generated pop songs? Now, some of us have touched on this a little bit already. If Anna, no, Anna's still not back. Anyway, Anna, just give me a yell if you can. Do you want to try?
You think I'm back now?
Yeah, that sounds back. Okay, go for it.
Okay. So many glitches. Throughout.
It was a glitch, but let's see how we go.
Everything it.
Sorry, Anna, it's not working. It's not working.
Okay,
sorry.
I'll try a little bit later then.
Okay. Yep. You'll have a whole half hour to yourself at the end, I think. Okay, so in that case, let's go on to Tom.
Sorry, I muted because there's some some background
so there
noise
is.
now. All right, so I mean, I think we're yeah. There's also a question in the Slack that gets to this a little bit. A question along the lines of separating the musical quality in terms of do listeners like it from the technical, so the strength of the models. Maybe we come back to that question on its own because it's probably merits consideration in and of itself, but it informs my answer, which is to say that I think we're still quite a long way from, you know, fully generated AI, which is what I think some people have in their head, or what they're encouraged to think about when there's like a lot of YouTube videos that are essentially kind of clickbait titles, and you know, says song composed by AI, or song by AI, and then, you know, we know because we're in the area that it's not true, or more or less of it has been done by humans. And that's what kind of interested me to be in this contest in the first place, which is you know, to try to tell that story a bit, because I think otherwise you're in danger of misleading the general public about where AI can go in terms of creativity, or where it's gone to date at least. Since this is called How We Rage with the Machine, I just wanted to make a connection to my favorite Rage Against the Machine song, which is Bomb Track. And I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but you know, I played it since when I was young, and it doesn't really make sense because it's a song filled with such rage, and I'm very I had a very middle class upbringing, and nothing was really difficult for me. But at guitar lessons, we'd play this song that was like burn, burn, something about burning. That's like shouted throughout the chorus. The way the riff starts in E minor for about a minute or so, and then the main riffs are all in F sharp minor. Like that shift it makes at the beginning of the song, I think is super cool, and what makes that song super cool. And I still think we're a long way off AI having kind of clever moments like that just make a song. So that's my answer.
Yeah.
I think we're still a long way off doing something that's actually impressive in terms of from beginning to end, which is, I think, a challenge worth doing in itself, but it's a separate challenge from how do we make this interesting for humans to work with along the way.
Yeah, quite right. Now, Anna's gone out and then come back in again. Do you want to have another go, Anna?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. Maybe I'll turn off my video and see if that's if I'm coming through more consistently.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think it's okay.
Okay, let's see. We're on the third question now. Maybe I'll echo some of the discussion earlier about this feedback loop between the artist and the AI, in terms of how it might kind of bring you to a new space, and kind of inspire you to go in a slightly different direction than what you might have gone before. That I think it's really interesting how that we can probably we can see that on kind of the very short time horizon of, okay, I'm like working with a model right now and iterating with it, but also as Ashley was mentioning, kind of throughout maybe a longer period of throughout an artist is multiple, that kind of co-evolution develop, like how does the technology kind of grow in different ways and kind of push the technology in different ways.
Okay,
And
thank you for that, Anna.
it
is cutting out a little bit, sorry, but yeah, that's an interesting point, that it's sort of like you're evolving with the AI. That's kind of your point there?
Yes, yeah. In terms of if going back to the question of if the songs created with AI are not as indistinguishable from human generated pop songs. I think because as a genre, pop as a genre, and also the artist is constantly evolving. I think this will be there will be an interesting kind of push and pull where we at some point we might think like, oh, this sounds typical, but then the artist will come in and innovate, and the technology might also give us kind of new ground to explore. And I think seeing that co-evolution would be really interesting.
I like that, co-evolution. Vincent, you wanted to comment.
Yeah, so I was looking in Slack, and there was a question on basically what Tom also mentioned. So the AI, basically the AI judging and the music judging, keeping those things separate. The question is, do we accept a good song with flaky AI or an inspired music created with a really virtuosic application of technology? And how do we basically integrate those two ways of evaluating? I think that's super interesting. So the reason why we split it up, I think, is in part because evaluating what is good music is just a very hard question, and kind of giving it to the public to decide is kind of like an easy way to do it, in a sense, easy way and a common way to do it. And it's also the way it works in the Eurovision contest. So that's those were some of the reasons why we chose to do that. And I wanted to mention that what was really interesting is that as an AI panel, we only looked at the AI part, so as a process document, and we did it anonymously. So we don't know who the people were. And when you look at our evaluations and the evaluations of the public, there's a super high correlation between the two judgments. Like there were some differences, but the ones we thought had really interesting AI also were highly rated by the public. So I thought that was really interesting, I think.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Now,
if I can jump in a little bit.
Sure.
For me, the judging process was I listened to all the songs first without looking at the process documents and without knowing what the entries were, where the entries were from, and kind of I had a ranking just by listening to the songs. And then I went back to look at what actually happened behind the scenes to create the song. And then I definitely saw myself kind of re-ranking the songs, because I felt once I knew more about the story behind and the kind of artistic intention and how they were trying really hard to get the machine learning models to do what they artistically wanted it to do, and that kind of negotiation process, and that involved a lot of kind of creative strategies that went into it. I think it made me kind of appreciate the subtlety of the sounds that we hear, and the musical structure, how there was a lot of creative thinking that went into it. And I think and definitely if the creative thinking and the creative output, that coherence was very strong, and the music quality was also very strong, that kind of synergy was very, we valued it very much. If kind of the team was able to kind of carry out this kind of go through all the challenges and carry out this kind of whole kind of complete story.
Ashley, you have your hand raised.
So yeah, it's just so interesting hearing what Anna was saying about how the story really helped her re-rank things, and that it just made me realize that on some level that's not so different with what happens with pop music in the real world, where the stories that are manufactured behind artists are often as much a part of people's appreciation or lack thereof of pop music as the music itself. And I also just wanted to point out with this question that it's a circular question in a very interesting way. So I think a lot of people forget or even don't know that in most countries, there isn't such a thing as the pop charts. The pop charts don't exist. The pop chart is, in most cases, officially an all-genre chart. Literally, whatever sells is whatever is going to appear on the charts. And by that metric, if there's an AI composer that's consistently getting songs even only up to number 75, but if there's an AI composer that's consistently getting songs on an all-genre chart up to 75, well then yes, by definition that's very, very interesting. You know, if it's indistinguishable, and then the question becomes, well, how do you do that? And part of that is what we were talking about in the last question. But again, I think what Anna was saying, the AI itself could be an interesting story, then in and of itself could become very, very trendy and could help support AI music on the charts.
Thank you for that. Now, I think we've heard from everyone except for me on that question. Just on a side note, I'm reminded of, I don't know if you've seen the anime Macross Plus, but there's an AI pop star in that called Sharon Apple. The music's actually written by Yoko Kanno, but I often think about that when I think about AI pop songs. And I must admit that when I came into this initially, I had the idea of generating a whole thing. I hadn't been working in the field. I've been doing algorithmic composition, and in that sense, I'm kind of generating all the notes, except I tend to have a human element anyway, just because I run out of time and do things manually. Yeah, so this was eye-opening for me, and I know when I presented the AI song contest techniques to my department, a computer science department, they also were expecting press the button, get the whole song. So it's partly also the media giving that impression. As far as this question, or part of my motivation for this question, is the things that interest me about songs is usually when they are a little bit different, a little bit quirky. And we certainly had a lot of that in the song contest entries, and that's what made them interesting. And in fact, like, our team intentionally kept the quirkiness when they could have removed it by ignoring the quirky bits and just using the generic things. But it's the quirky things that make it special. So if you train on existing stuff and it's not surprising, as Ashley said, you're going to lose interest. But yeah, for me, there has to be that interesting, surprising element. Otherwise, yeah, it would not be interesting for me anyway. Vincent, you want to comment? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, just a quick comment, like what you said about wanting to generate a complete piece, like starting out wanting to generate a complete piece. That's a lot of the teams wrote that in their process document, or at least a couple that they started out with. We're going to build the system that's going to generate a complete piece of music, and then either some teams were then they had a band perform it, or other said we're going to synthesize everything, or start out from trying to build an end-to-end audio generator, for example, to generate a pop song. But all of them failed in doing that, which shows it's a really hard problem. And that's also the reason why everybody broke it down to smaller little bits and pieces, which is manageable and also more fun to do, I think, in the end, from a musical perspective.
Yeah. So, and I know with Uncanny Valley, it was never the intention to go end to end. It was just my idea when I came to the team. Surely we can automate everything. They said, no, this is what we will do. And I said, well, we can automate this little bit. Yes, you can automate that little bit, Sandra. But yeah, so it was great fun though. Shall we move on to the next question? This is where we start to look at plagiarism, that we train on existing pieces of music and then generate things. How can we measure the extent to which resulting songs and pieces plagiarize existing music? Now, I was going to ask Tom to talk about this one.
Thank you. So my feeling is that there's good answers out here on this already. I think that while there will be debate about what is and what isn't an applicable similarity measure, we can kind of put that to one side. So, you know, there's always going to be a question of compare these notes with these notes, or this audio with this audio. What do we mean when we say, you know, plagiarize, or how similar are these two things? But I think the general approach seems fairly uncontroversial, which is that if you've got the world's music, or you've got a smaller subset of input corpus to some algorithmic process, then either during or after that generation process, you can, you know, take a moving window and measure as a function of time in your generated passages the most similar patch of similar length in the input data. So that's kind of what I've started to do in my research group, because I have, you know, students working on things like listening studies where we're asking people to listen to music by multiple algorithms and compare them. And as I've advised students in preparing these listening studies, I've noticed, oh, you can't put that in the listening study. Okay, you say it's from this algorithm, but it's also from Haydn, Opus, whatever, you know, measures 4 to 9. You can't, you know, pass that off as computer generated. So this is a question that I think comes up a lot as well, which is, you know, when is something novel versus too derivative of existing music? And you know, that's a question for hundreds of years, because for hundreds of years, students of music have written stylistic compositions and they submit them every year, and, you know, their instructors listen to them and grade them. And so I think that you can also baseline it, because you can do a leave one out approach where you take some of the input corpus to one side and see how much that is similar to other input pieces. So you can get a distribution of how much, let's say if we're doing Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, how much they borrow from themselves. And if your algorithm is, you know, outside of the confidence interval of that, then it's derivative. And if it's inside or below it, it's novel. That's my answer anyway.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point, because of course composers plagiarized each other all over the place hundreds of years ago, and it wasn't a problem. I'm not 100% sure of what the legality is these days to do with jazz improvisation, but there's the idea of a quote, which can be problematic if you know, you get sued, like happened to the very unfortunate flautist, well, not the flautist that got sued, but Men at Work for the short fragment of about 1 bar or 2 bars of flute solo, which quoted Kookaburra Sits in the Old Gum Tree. And it was not known about for decades until it came up on some TV show of someone saying, have you ever noticed that this sounds like Kookaburra Sits in the... And the person who owned the rights to that song, which was originally donated to the Australian Girl Guides Association, but then somebody purchased it and sued Men at Work for that particular plagiarism. And very sadly, the flautist actually committed suicide in the end. And it was actually very badly handled in the courts. And, you know, people in Australia tend to be a little bit scared of actually saying, hey, that sounds like this other song, because, you know, the consequences could be deadly. Yeah, from quite unintentional quotes. So it can be quite a serious thing. And it's yeah, when I originally started my PhD, I was saying to somebody earlier, that was one of the things I thought about. I'd grown up hearing about how George Harrison had been sued for My Sweet Lord being like, he's so fine. And it does sound like he's so fine, and other cases. And when you work from inspiration, you get this idea and you work with it. You don't know where it came from. It could be a quote from something else that you've plagiarized. I've been told I accidentally plagiarized the Harry Potter theme once, so I threw that piece away. And the same happens with AI, and the same techniques can be used, and forensic musicology is the field where they do that in the legal sense. And of course, in music information retrieval, we've studied it in a computational algorithm sense. So yeah, it goes a little bit beyond just AI, because it's human compositions as well as AI ones. Anyway, Vincent, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that question, or anybody else from the panel?
Well, maybe what I can add is that so we just created a blog post on the ethics of the AI Song Contest, and we asked the teams also to reflect a little bit on the ethics of the AI and in the piece that they used. And so on for this particular question, it was phrased slightly differently, but so we looked at whether the teams commented on whether they checked for duplicated material. So if they used the training set, if in the output in some way some musical phrases would end up that were part of the input. And actually from all the teams, 8 didn't comment on it, on that, on whether they checked for duplicated material. 2 teams checked for duplicated materials. One team considered it, but they didn't check, and 2 teams they didn't consider it. So there were some teams who put thought into it, but it wasn't on the top of everybody's mind, let's say.
Actually, that's an interesting point. I don't know where our team stood in that. Possibly commented didn't do or something. We were happy to get anything that actually sounded like a decent melody at all, and it took a little bit of tweaking for that. So I think we were probably felt we're pretty safe in terms of not plagiarizing, given the kinds of melodies that were generated. So thank you for that. We've got one other question before we go to the questions from elsewhere, which is related to the last one. For AI, oh, Ashley, did you wanted to say something about the previous question?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to follow up a little more on what
please
you were,
do.
Yeah, what you were saying, Sandra, you know, about how this has been treated and how it's been looked at computationally in the field of music information retrieval. And I just wanted to point out that when we think of computational forensic musicology, if we can get that specific, we're often thinking of an algorithm that could give either a binary yes, no, or maybe a softer, probability on how likely is it that this particular piece or this particular fragment has been plagiarized under a particular legal framework. And these are always legal frameworks, sometimes infuriatingly non-musical frameworks. But even if you think of it as a completely legal question, and if you think of it as just, this is a classifier that's going to give me a yes, no, or a soft yes, no, and is this plagiarized or not, if you actually look at how that algorithm works, and how is an AI forensic musicologist able to determine whether something is plagiarized or not, looking at the details of that model could actually be very interesting for someone who is trying to compose AI music, to learn either, okay, what are very specific things that I need to avoid, or even something that you could build in as part of the compositional process to steer the AI away from anything that might leave you at a risk of plagiarism, instead of it just being a very rough post hoc check.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Maybe like a GAN, a generative adversarial network, where one is the plagiarism checker, and says,
yeah,
that could potentially be an interesting approach. Okay, let's move on to our last question before we have our last free for all. What are the implications for intellectual property? Well, we kind of started talking about it here, but what about the one thing that's happened with Uncanny Valley is they've started to become at the forefront of how the intellectual property laws need to change a little bit, or at least the contracts. Like we had a contract for the registering our song and an agreement for ownership of the song. And certainly from our perspective, it was quite clear the humans owned the song, not the AI. And in our case, the team included, the producer, the developers that were involved, pretty much the whole team. But do you see, for example, a point where there could be an AI that is able to own IP, or is it always going to be someone else? And if so, who? Your thoughts, maybe Tom?
Yeah, I had recently read Bob's article as well, so I just thought I'd mention that now. Artificial intelligence and music, open questions of copyright law and engineering practice. And I mean, I just think, to be honest, the whole system is a bit broken. I mean, the music plagiarism, cases we discuss them because it's a massively, biased system in terms of who gets cases brought against them and how those are actually handled. And yeah, I just think the streaming revenue system is also broken. So I think that probably, the way forward in a positive sense for music makers and for people who develop code but never see any reward for that, shall we say, is maybe a new music ecosystem where there is probably, in terms of ease of use, a largely hidden ledger of activity, be that purely human creative activity or somehow symbiotic with AI, so that if and when money is made, say through advertising revenue or whatever, there is at least a paper trail of activity, of who or what has done what. And then, the ethics can be, the ethical side of things, the legal side of things can continue to evolve, and then fairer systems of reward can be put in place because there is that paper trail to go back to. So yeah, I think that obviously the legal situation, it's like, it's way behind where the technology is. It's not fit for purpose. And on the other side, you know, music makers by and large aren't making much money from music, especially in 2020, but you know, even before that.
Yeah, quite right. Thank you for that. You had a bit of background noise. And it totally distracted me. So I will jump to who else wanted to say something about this question.
I can I can say something again from the process documents where the participants also discussed these ethical questions, also these implications for intellectual property. So we when we asked them like who did the teams actually mention when they mentioned ownership of the song that they created? A large majority, they mention actually the developers or the AI systems that they're using. So these are also things like TensorFlow, for example, or things like that, where while a much smaller group would only mention themselves, and only one, I think, one group, only one team mentioned that the musicians that provided the data sets, the training data sets. So this is, I think, it's a really like a view that really wouldn't work in the musical world, where developers of technology like TensorFlow or other ways where you can build software in or models, that they would be part of the would have a stake in ownership, like I guess Fender having a stake in ownership of every song that's being played on their guitars, for example. Like that would be, and that would be really interesting to think to hear what Portrait XO thinks of this perspective as an artist.
So when it comes to copyright and algorithms, I do have this conversation often with data bots, and it feels like similar conversations I have with friends, like producer friends, when we talk about sampling. And I think like also like Tom mentioned before, of like plagiarism being a topic that's existed for hundreds of years. I think we're in this place where now we have these technological tools that can maybe help highlight or keep track or show us when these things happen in much more intricate ways, and maybe that's why it's become even a hotter topic. And I don't know the exact answers either, but I also have like a very kind of loose view on copyright anyway, because I love sampling music, and I think it's and when I talk to my producer friends, they have such varying opinions, and at the end of it, I think it's, you know, we're all interpreting stuff that we hear anyway, and we're just like remixing ideas in our heads all the time, and then putting our own like rendition of stuff. What would be really interesting would be to like listen to some industry experts, like lawyers, and hear where their thoughts are on all of this. And because right now in my head, I kind of look at all of this a bit looser. I don't know. Yeah, does it belong to the algorithm? Does it belong to the coder who invented the thing? Because it wouldn't exist without it. But then the output wouldn't exist without the music that goes into it. So yeah, I don't have the answers, but I can only explain how I feel about it. And I think it's a shame. The only danger I find about these conversations sometimes is taking the kind of like experimental and the creative spirit out of these processes. And I think to discover new ways of doing things, we really need to have the freedom to explore, and without having these kind of blocks in our heads. But yeah, those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that That's sort of my frustration. I am from in both ends of intellectual property, in the sense that I'm a creator and also a user of intellectual property. And as a creator, don't steal my songs. And from the other side, I'm thinking, why can't I use your songs to do this creative thing? And I think the problem is that the legal and commercial world has very much taken over in terms of the profits, and the laws are not really suitable for creatives themselves. And that's something that, I mean, AI just reflects that as well. As I think Portrait XO and others have said, we, through our lives, absorb music, visual stimuli, everything, and whatever we've absorbed from wherever is what inspires us to produce what we produce. So, you know, if we listen to lots of, you know, jazz, classical, Beethoven, Beatles, whatever, that influences what we produce. And the AI is the same. You train it on all this stuff, and then it produces stuff. We're getting close to time, so I might just look at the questions that we haven't answered yet that have come up in Slack. Now, I believe you already answered one for us, Vincent. Bob Sturm asks, will there be an AI song contest next year? Vincent?
Yes, we're in the process of organizing next year's edition. I don't have all the details yet, but please contact me if you're interested in participating. Send me an email or send me a message on Slack if you're on Slack. But yes, we want to have a next edition next year.
Yeah. Bob also asks, how far in the future will we have the course AI Music Appreciation?
Is that appreciation by music that's composed by AI, or AI appreciating the music?
That is a good question. Well, who is the student going to be? Ashley, you had something to say.
So yes, so I just thought immediately of it probably becoming very old-fashioned now, but when I was working toward a PhD in musicology, our comprehensive exams included a nasty exam called the spots, where any fragment of music from any human culture since the beginning of time was fair game, and you would be played just a small fragment of music, and you were expected to write, maybe one page, still on paper back then, identifying the piece of music if you could, and discussing, its style, how related, say something interesting, about what you heard. And it actually doesn't sound so far off to me that you could be expected, if there's enough AI music out there, to be sufficiently familiar with AI music that you could hear a small clip and say, oh, yeah, that's characteristic of this algorithm. If you listen carefully to the artifacts, you can hear around the edges that, this isn't done very well, or this particular timbre, was really classic for music composed in this particular style. And so how soon will it happen in the future? I don't know. In that sense, I can't answer the question. But the idea that even without understanding all that much about the technology itself, that with the sufficient critical mass, a well-informed listener could tell what the AI, which AI was used, just as well as they now can tell who, was the artist behind something, sounds very plausible to me.
Portrait XO, you had a comment you wanted to say about intellectual property, I believe. Has that already been dealt with, or have I forgotten?
Oh, yeah, I just had a thought. Maybe when it comes to plagiarism, like as a writer, I might be interested if there was like an AI tool that listened to something I created and then told me 50% of this sounds like something, 20% sounds like this, or if the AI like fed off of this huge database of music and was like smart enough to specifically tell me this melody here, that comes from these songs, and I can listen to a whole bunch of songs that are similar to that or exact melody or whatever. Maybe that'll also serve as an interesting self-reflective thing, like questioning myself as an artist now that I know this information. Do I still want to proceed? But yeah, just a thought. If anybody out there wants to create something like this.
Yeah, some of us kind of are. Yep. Okay, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you all so much for your participation and fantastic answers to the questions and discussion. And thank you to the people that have been following along and asking questions. And sorry if I didn't see them all, but we'll certainly follow up on in the Slack channel if anything else comes up afterwards. And I think we should finish there. Thank you.